Greetings, viewers. If you've been believing some of the noises and murmurings that have been coming from the various rumour and propaganda mills around the place, you may have been led to believe that the US is threatening Iran and is about to attack Iran. No, it's not. And it's kind of amazing that people are actually still sort of buying that line. We've been told that the US is about to attack Iran for many years. And supposedly the US and Iran have been bitter enemies since 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini hijacked the Iranian Revolution and took over the place. Everyone seems to be missing what is logically obvious, but not necessarily intuitively obvious, and that is that the US establishment and the Iranian Islamist establishment are actually covert allies, all the while making lots of noises in public at each other. Now, this may be counterintuitive to a lot of people, either people who want to see the US attack Iran or people who don't want the US to attack Iran. However, the evidence for it exists in abundance, and I really wish people would start looking at it more, because this is a sick joke that's been going on for a long time. So, what is the evidence that the US establishment and the Iranian theocracy are covert allies? Well, the evidence exists in abundance, and it shows quite clearly that the US establishment has been allied with the Iranian Islamists all the way back to 1979. But let's start off with a bit more recent history. We had the spectacle a few months ago of Ahmadinejad coming to a prestigious American university and being allowed to basically talk his crap without any real opposition. Now, has anyone stopped to think how ridiculous this spectacle was? The leader of a country which is supposedly part of an axis of evil that that the US is about to attack, blah blah blah, etc., ad infinitum rhetoric. And yet he's allowed into the country to give a speech at a prestigious American university. Can you imagine Saddam Hussein, when he was still alive, obviously? Can you imagine if Saddam Hussein had come to an American university, or, for that matter, any other of the traditional enemies of the United States? It's pretty ridiculous. It's pretty odd. And then we have a look at who this Ahmadinejad actually is, and the one thing the Western media is covering up very well, and that is his role with the Basiji children. These were the children who, throughout the 1980s, they'd age between 12 and 18 or thereabouts, who would be used as cannon fodder. They'd be used to throw their bodies against Iraqi artillery. They'd be used to disarm minefields. There's a link to an article about that, along with a link to a lot of other articles and resources on this issue in the description column. And in that article there's a bit of preliminary analysis, and it points out that this is what Ahmadinejad said at the UN, I don't know, it was a few months ago now. He's talking about the US occupation of Iraq, saying, "The occupiers are incapable of establishing security in Iraq. Despite the establishment of the lawful government and National Assembly of Iraq, there are covert and overt efforts to heighten insecurity, magnify and aggravate differences within Iraqi society, and instigate civil strife." Now, what's wrong with this speech, and why did the media, in the Western media, not report it? Well, isn't there something a bit strange about the leader of a country that's supposedly next on the list of countries to be attacked by the United States, and whose troops are right next door in the neighbouring country, going to the UN and saying the occupiers aren't capable of establishing security? And despite the establishment of the lawful government, well, who established that lawful government? It was the United States. So, there's little snippets like that. But it goes much further than that, and I really wish I had the time to go through it all. But a few highlights I'll bring up. Like, all throughout 2003, there were numerous instances where the Iranians helped the US invasion of Iraq, including there's one instance where the Australian Navy was warned about some approaching Iraqi speedboats packed with explosives and presumably suicide bombers by the Iranian Coast Guard. And in fact, the Iranian Coast Guard intercepted one of those ships and chased the other two away. So in other words, the Iranian Coast Guard saved the Australian Navy from a possible catastrophe. Why would they do that? Why would Iran help the invasion of Iraq like that? And there's heaps of other examples. You know, US quietly bombs anti-regime Iranian rebels. And the US and Iran cooperating over moving the Mujahideen from Afghanistan into Bosnia in the early 90s to help spark the Balkans Wars. 1979, during the Iranian hostage crisis, where the Iranian government held 90 Americans hostage in the US embassy in Tehran. Who did the US get to act as negotiator? The PLO, which in another video I've made I explained that the PLO, or Al-Fatah, is descended from the German Nazi final solution. So here's the US establishment using an organisation, a terrorist group, descended from the German Nazi final solution to negotiate with the Ayatollah Khomeini. Only it was grand theatre, as the article will explain. It gets quite complicated, but as you go through it, the evidence is impressive, as is the logic of the arguments. Not to mention that the Ayatollah Khomeini kept Savak, which was the Shah's, the previous dictator of Iran's, his intelligence service, which the CIA had built for him. The Ayatollah Khomeini kept it. He just renamed it to Savama, but basically it was the same personnel. And it's also, if you can remember the 1980s, all throughout the 80s, it was the big bad Ayatollah, and there's the other Middle Eastern bad guy of choice, Colonel Gaddafi. But then, who gets attacked in the early 90s? Iraq! Probably not too much of a surprise, really, when you consider that Zalmay Khalilzad, who became the US envoy to Iraq, and so on, in 1989, early 89, after the Iran-Iraq war was over, fretted that Iraq had 45 battle-tested divisions, Iran only had 12. In other words, that Iraq was too strong compared to Iran, and he advocated strengthen Iran, contain Iraq, which is exactly what happened 2 years later when Desert Storm was launched. There was, of course, the recent Iranian hostage crisis with the British sailors, and there's an article here that compares that to the hostage crisis of '79. On it goes, and then you've got this latest Strait of Hormuz incident with George Bush, pretending to look a bit stupid and helpless, as he's saying, "Oh yes, our ships are moving along very peacefully, and the Iranians are being provocative, and my advice to them is don't do it." I mean, it was pathetic, and it was obviously pathetic. I mean, George Bush is acting. He's really not as stupid as he often comes across, okay? And certainly the people behind him are certainly not stupid. So let's get past this Bush is an idiot garbage, because that's what it is. So what's the bigger picture? Right, well, this may be quite difficult for a lot of people to believe, but again, there's an enormous amount of evidence which will take quite a while to absorb it. I'll admit I've been studying this stuff for years. The US has a pro, and not just the US, it's also the EU, for that matter Australia, and various other democratic countries actually have a pro-Islamo-fascist agenda. Why would they do this? Very complicated. But basically, Islam is being used as a geopolitical weapon, and not just simply by Islamic nations, but by the major powers. And one of the agendas which seems to be unfolding, one of the things which Iran looks set to be used for, is to destroy Israel. Again, I've spoken about that in another video, and we'll doubtless talk about it again, to launch the next genocide of Jews. Now, I'm sure I shouldn't get too many arguments from anyone with any common sense out there that this shouldn't be allowed to happen. But one of the ways it is being allowed to happen is by keeping people ignorant of the true nature of the relationship between the United States, the State of Israel, and Iran. So I strongly urge people to look more into it and stop buying into this the US is about to attack Iran crap. Because the only way I can see that the US is going to attack Iran is if they launch a completely futile strike to give Iran an excuse to attack Israel. Anyway, that's enough for now. Please absorb the information. Read it. It's good information.